Hopefully testimonial of my logical, coherent self. I'm now launching into my second podcast. This one's about something very serious about autism. I've done a lot of research, and I just want to briefly suggest my theory, the Courtney spectrum. Over here on this part of the spectrum, as Eric Kendall tells us about in The Age of Insight, is a language of subjectivity where one can convey so much, and one assumes that this is mere neuron capability, so much synergy, so much embrace of the other, and the agility of, empathizing with that person and adopting ground rules according to that person. So that end of the spectrum he talks about, in art and pushing creativity and the whole notion that is, a voyage into uncertainty. You don't know what you're going to discover about yourself till you get to a point of discovery. And on the other end of the spectrum, I see autism. So Simon Baron-Cohen talks about how autism might be, an evolutionary step, given the fact, so this is Science of Evil on Empathy and the Origins of Cruelty, Simon Baron-Cohen. So, the other end of this spectrum, autism, which in my Courtney spectrum, so you go from high subjectivity over here, existential subjectivity on top of, mortal coil, corporeal, self, economic entity, something else inflated far, beyond that, where the most profound minds have ventured forth. Now, autism is something that we also have all in us, because within the autism spectrum there's a spectrum, and within us we have everything: bipolarity, attention deficit, there's different places that twig certain currents in the brain, because as the brain forests itself, it creates, these axons and dendrites and then myelinates, and the actually Voltaire had, or Montesquieu had, this idea about people who could see microscopically. When you look at Daniel Tammet and how he describes how horrified school was for him, because he's trying to figure out, navigate room to room, and yet he's only looking at, a postage stamp on the wall. And that precision of focus, like the Rain Man when he looks at the toothpicks on the floor and so on, that fascination with detail, or Charlie in Flowers for Algernon when the beads spill and so on. There are characterizations that infiltrate all of us, because but then there's this other place on the spectrum. And autism, Asperger's, male extreme syndrome, because males have not been orienteering in terms of their emotions, therefore they have become somewhat incapacitated. They just hit a brick wall when their thinking tries to get beyond, the concept, and that's why so much domestic abuse and so on is happening on this April 13th. 2020. And so the whole idea of what characterizes anything on my spectrum is subjectivity. That's why art is appreciated, but art is, virtually non-existent now. It's been taken over by, the pseudo-art, the bourgeois, the people who have piano lessons and yoga studios upstairs. I shouldn't put everybody down like that. Yeah, but one has to criticize that careful, prosthetic that has become art, because art should try to evoke and provoke neurogenesis, neuroplasticity, bring on a wave of altered states so that the entangled and embedded self on the spectrum can alleviate its position, let down its guard, its defense mechanisms in terms of, Wilhelm Reich and so on. And a lot of this, I think, is documented. Daniel Tammet, how he's evolved, has happened, in my theory, by the focus of people on him and the camera on him and him being able to see his self-concept. There's a local comedian who wrote a book, Funny You Don't Look Autistic. Same thing. He's spent a lot of time on camera. He's developed a self-concept, and therefore, this rigidity of fascination with detail and postage stamp size criteria of involvement needs to move. It's the same thing in Autism on Acid, that's articulated so well in terms of the progressive character change of what that person, Aaron Orsini, was going through. And that's profound. To have a man on the moon, to have somebody who's put that together. I think I put it together in my books, which are Neurogenesis, Theory of Mind, and The Art of Sanity. And I've done a more, atomically correct version of mapping out this territory. But think about it. If you have two parents who are math professors at MIT, the likelihood that their child might be autistic is so much more, percentage-wise. And this is, this refining genetically of the ability to do math as a positive thing. But then, you see, here's where the mistakes get made in terms of evolution. And I'm not saying divergent thinking and all that. Obviously it has a place. I get frustrated with the autism community. I've approached people. There's also, another couple autistic reference points. Switched On also maps out a lot of that territory, and a lot of that comes from camera, attention, self-concept development, because once you see yourself from the outside in, and there's Indigenous man, young man, River McLeod in Six Nations, who likewise, because he was learning hoop dance, and then he became fascinated with his mother's phone, but watching hoop dancers so he could learn hoop dancing, watching himself, again, self-concept, enormous confidence, and, covering that terrain from the rigidity where Rain Man recoils in terms of any emotional involvement. This guy was self-mutilating, etc., etc. And, think of the expanse of mind. But again, there is a prescriptiveness, a very daunting prescriptiveness in the whole realm of autism. People think that you have to impose methodology, training, and so on, and that's the very thing that then is going to, when Helen Keller and the word water flooded over her consciousness, that was a poignant moment. And those poignant moments, instead of being, aroused by, well, I've described things in my book that could help, like a whole park with some movie screens that are looping the people who are playing, and people with guitars and balloons, and just an extraordinarily happy scene where several autistic people could grapple with that, and then in this moment of trajectory, because that's what it is, it's a neurological trajectory, it's a firing and wiring trajectory. And the psychedelic experiments in the 60s, as profiled in the book Autism on Acid, the kids immediately gained this subjective awareness, immediately looked at the people who were looking after them differently. And if it's something that simple, then we should address it. Some people, as one could set up scenarios where the energy is established as a fluidness in terms of trying to opportune that trajectory moment, so that one can just get a little bit, over the fence of their current rigidity into that land, and then look back at themselves. In Switched On, he talks about photographs of him. He's the one who developed the pyrotechnics for KISS, and amazing book, amazing attention to his own evolution of awareness. Absolutely, 100% endorsed it. John Elder Robison, amazing book, and through what he did in terms of mapping things out, I think we can see, just in terms of his intersubjectivity, he does, sort of make one mistake though. He thinks that people can understand or apprehend other people simply by looking into their eyes. And that's not the case, of course. And that's the whole thing about subjectivity, and psychopaths can disguise it so well, because sociopaths, psychopaths, they don't have the emotional feelings, so they can step on people on their way up and not even grimace. And that also, that character needs to externalize their power domain. Political people have to externalize it. They can't internalize the space. They need the ego representation of what that configuration means. But at any rate, that's male extreme syndrome. That's downplaying the emotions, learning to incapacitate the emotions, essentially. In terms of any sort of navigational evolution, one's stuck in a certain realm, and the needle doesn't want to move. But we all need to move the needle. We all are on the spectrum. We all need to gain more metaphor, conceptual awareness, allegory, analogy. All these things fulfill so much in terms of, if you just think of dark energy, dark flow, dark matter, how 95% of the universe is now not understood. And what what are the contingency factors that are beyond the veil in terms of what that means. And then you think of neurology, and you think of neurogenesis, the infinite and eternal birth of new neurons that can actually influence directly physicality and the whole kinesiology of what and who we are, from biomechanical to biopsychological to bio-emotional beasts that we are. These configurations within our neural maps and where we trigger firing and wiring incidents and how we trigger them. And I think, the evidence is out there over and over in terms of Daniel Tammet's description of his own thought processes, how he can learn a language like Icelandic language in a week and be interviewed in that language on Recite Pi for 4.5 hours. But again, he can't remember, the face of his own partner, has to carry a updated version of that picture in his wallet so he knows to connect to that person. And he wouldn't remember your face if you talked to him, an hour before. So there's the, here's the sacrifice in terms of going, but society has always gone whole hog because of patriarchy, because of mathematics and science, from Locke, through all those guys who saw, experiment in materialistic terms. So it's very interesting that we are on the run by a coronavirus that is totally invisible and freaking us out because of its invisibility. And these levels of uncertainty are there and, have been there for some time. But because of the digital ramifications of a culture that's speeding so fast, that one day, replaces the next, and this information gets diffused into the next information, and where does one, create the shape of, the environment for one's mind to be able to digest and filter and keep at bay the consequences of the energies that one is infiltrated by. But at any rate, I wanted to sort of set the record straight. Hopefully I have on autism. Simon Baron-Cohen's work is crucial here. Eric Kendall, The Age of Insight, also crucial. But many other efforts switched on again. Autism on Acid, all of Daniel Tammet's works, great insights to be had there. And I'm sure I'm missing others. But that's the Courtney spectrum. All I did was take what they talk about the autism end of the spectrum and what Simon Baron-Cohen has mapped out and what Eric Kendall mapped out, and I put them, and I said, oh yeah, everything makes sense now. Mental illness makes sense, because within the rigidity of our own redundancy, neurogenesis, neuroplasticity dries up, the brain dries up, we become robots. And that becomes a problem for a brain, 100 billion neuron Ferrari brain universe that needs to take a drive, out in the country and fashion an existence that's multiple levels beyond the more coherent, cognitive, left brain packaged mind. So all of society has been leaning towards autism. It has been in vogue. When I was in university, a Bachelor of Science degree was considered wise. Bachelor of Art degree, we probably wouldn't get a job. Everything, the whole thing about the international stuff about the mathematical and science profiling between nations and the other one, I don't remember these. Well, they sort of postdated my teaching career. I've just become familiar with what they are. But at any rate, the emphasis, well, now they put an A in it, whatever that sequence of letters is. But mostly people are interested in science and math. And, humanity, the humanities, art, music, anything that arouses consciousness within a domain that isn't beguiled by this categorical, and it's a categorical compromise, improvise, ducking the punches as digital reality comes at us. And where on the spectrum has everything to do, so I guess my last request to anyone with autistic children, put them on camera, show them a picture of themselves every day, and particularly if you can catch them laughing or emoting, they will have a mirror neuron reaction with their own self. That will engage a level of subjectivity and a perception of one as a self-entity and hence self-concept worthy.